On December 20th, 1972, a Chilean muleteer named Sergio Catalan was riding through a remote Andean valley when he noticed two figures coming down from the snowline. At first, he thought they were lost hikers. Then he saw their faces and the way they moved, thin, sunburned, limping, and barely steady on their feet. They looked less like travelers and more like people who had been kept alive by sheer refusal to die. A fast river separated them. They shouted across the water, trying to make themselves understood over the noise. Catalan could not catch every word, but one word came through clearly. Plane. Behind them, high above that valley, there was a wreck on a glacier. And inside that wreck, there were still people alive. The world had already stopped searching. The families had already been told to prepare for the worst. And yet 16 human beings had survived for 72 days in the Andes, long enough for the mountains to become a second reality and for ordinary morality to become a question of endurance. This story has been told in books, documentaries, and films, but the true timeline is powerful on its own. What happened did not unfold like a screenplay. It unfolded like a slow, brutal equation: cold plus altitude plus injuries plus hunger, measured one day at a time. If you appreciate deep, serious documentaries like this one, consider subscribing. It helps us bring more untold stories to light. Let's go back to the beginning. In October 1972, members of the Old Christians Club rugby team from Uruguay were traveling to Santiago, Chile for a match. Friends and family were aboard as well. For most of them, it was supposed to be routine: an overnight stay in another country, a game, and then home. The aircraft was a Fairchild Hiller FH-227D, operated by the Uruguayan Air Force on a charter flight historically known as Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. There were 45 people on board, 40 passengers and 5 crew. On October 12, 1972, the plane left Montevideo bound for Santiago. Weather over the Andes forced an unscheduled stop in Mendoza, Argentina, where the group spent the night. The following day, Friday, October 13th, the plane took off from Mendoza in the early afternoon. The route was meant to avoid the highest peaks by taking a longer path through a mountain pass. But visibility was poor, and the crew had to rely heavily on navigation estimates and timing. Somewhere inside cloud cover, the flight drifted into the kind of mistake aviation history is full of: a decision made with incomplete information, followed by a descent that began too early. As the aircraft descended toward what the crew believed was safer terrain, the mountains were still there, hidden by cloud and distance, waiting in front of the nose. When the cloud broke, the pilots saw a ridge directly ahead. They tried to climb. They increased power. The aircraft pitched upward. It was not enough. In the mid-afternoon, the plane struck the mountain. The impact tore the tail section away, then one wing, then the other. What remained of the fuselage, still packed with passengers, became a sliding capsule of metal and bodies. It skidded down a glacier at high speed, bouncing, scraping, and shedding debris, until it finally slammed into a snowbank and stopped. For a moment, there was silence that felt unreal. The high-altitude quiet that makes the world seem empty even when it is full of screaming. 12 people died in the crash itself. Others died soon afterward from injuries. 33 were alive after the first hours. But alive was only the beginning. The wreck sat high in the Andes on a remote glacier near the border region between Argentina and Chile. There were no trees, no shelters, no roads, and no visible settlements, just rock, snow, and wind. At that altitude, breathing is work. Healing is slow. Infection is fast. And at night, the temperature dropped to levels the human body is not designed to endure without protection. Inside the fuselage, survivors lay among twisted seats and wreckage, surrounded by the injured. Legs were broken, faces were cut. Some had head trauma and internal injuries that could not be treated. 2 medical students among the passengers, Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino, helped organize triage with almost nothing. No real antiseptic, no anesthesia, and no equipment beyond what could be scavenged. They did what they could, but the mountain set the terms. If no one found them quickly, the cold would. The fuselage was the only shelter they had, but it was open where the tail had been torn away. Wind blasted through the cabin. Snow drifted inside. Every hour, they lost heat they could not replace. They began to engineer survival. They used luggage, seat frames, and scraps of metal to close the opening as best they could. They built a low wall of packed snow outside to slow the wind. Inside, they arranged themselves in the narrow cabin so that bodies became insulation. There was no fire. There were no sleeping bags. They survived nights by pressing together, taking turns at the worst spots, and trying not to fall asleep so deeply that their bodies stopped fighting. Even water was a problem. Snow was everywhere, but eating snow lowers body temperature. They needed to melt it, and they had to do it slowly with improvised methods, using sunlight when they could, and whatever metal surfaces they could position to warm. The sun, when it came, brought new danger, glare, and snow blindness. They improvised crude eye protection from scraps, anything that could reduce reflected light. These weren't clever tricks. They were the difference between seeing and going blind. For the first days, there was hope, because there was reason for hope. Search aircraft from multiple countries began combing the Andes. Families in Uruguay assumed rescue would be a matter of time. The survivors heard engines overhead and ran outside whenever they could, waving and shouting, but the wreck's white fuselage blended into the snow. From above, it was nearly invisible. After 8 days, officials suspended the search. The survivors did not immediately know that. They were trapped inside their own struggle. But around the second week, after they managed to get a small radio working, they heard the words that changed everything. The search had been called off. In one moment, hope became responsibility. If they stayed where they were, they would die there. Their food supply was almost nothing. Small snacks meant for a short flight, a little chocolate, a little wine, whatever could be found in pockets and bags. It ran out quickly. There was nothing to hunt, nothing to gather, no vegetation, no animals, only snow and rock. Starvation at altitude is not a gradual weakening. It is the body consuming itself until it cannot. That is when they reached the decision that would define the public reaction to their story. They began to eat the flesh of those who had died. This was not done lightly. It was debated, resisted, prayed over, and treated as an act of necessity rather than choice. Many of them were Catholic, and the psychological barrier was as real as the hunger. But the alternative was certain death. They made the decision, and it kept people alive long enough for rescue to become possible. On the night of October 29th, 16 days after the crash, another disaster struck. An avalanche slammed into the fuselage while many were asleep. Snow and ice flooded the cabin and buried their shelter almost completely. People were pinned, some suffocated. When it finally stopped, 8 more were dead. The survivors were now entombed inside their own shelter, trapped in darkness beneath the snow. They dug and clawed at the packed ice to create air, using whatever they could as tools. For days, they lived in a cramped, freezing void where movement was limited and time felt distorted. The mountain was not finished with them. It never is. At different points, small expeditions left the fuselage to search for supplies. They found scattered wreckage. They found bits of food and clothing. They eventually located the detached tail section. Inside were items that felt like treasure. Extra clothes, a few supplies, and the aircraft's batteries. They tried to use those batteries to power the plane's radio and transmit a distress call. It didn't work. The electrical mismatch made the plan impossible, and they spent days learning that the hard way. When they finally abandoned the radio effort, the conclusion was unavoidable. No message was going out. If anyone was going to be saved, someone had to walk out of the Andes. They had one problem that made escape almost impossible: night. You can walk in daylight. You cannot survive the Andean night at altitude without insulation. So they built what they didn't have. Using insulation from the wreck, wiring, and waterproof fabric, they constructed an improvised sleeping bag, a crude, heavy barrier that could keep 2 people alive long enough to wake up and move again. When it was finished, the escape attempt became real. On December 12, 1972, 3 men left the crash site carrying the sleeping bag: Fernando Nando Parado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Tintin Vicentin. They carried minimal supplies and a responsibility that was almost unbearable. 14 other survivors were waiting behind them, and time was running out. For weeks, many of them believed Chile was close, just over the ridge. That belief was a form of survival. You can keep walking if you think the end is near. But when they finally climbed high enough to see beyond the rim of the glacier, the truth hit harder than the cold. There was no green valley below. There was no nearby road. There were mountains in every direction, ridge after ridge, peak after peak. Chile was not close. It was far. They had started a journey without knowing the real size of the map. After 3 days, Vicentin turned back so that the remaining food would last longer for the two who would continue. Parado and Canessa pushed on alone. What followed was not heroic in the cinematic sense. It was mostly exhaustion. They walked across ridges and valleys, through terrain that gave them nothing and took everything. They rationed what little they carried. They slept in the improvised bag. They fought altitude sickness, dehydration, and the constant risk of slipping into a fall that would end the story instantly. Every day began with the same question: can we stand up again? And every day ended with the same problem: if we stop moving, we die. After about 10 days, they saw movement that didn't belong to the mountains. A man on horseback, Sergio Catalan. A river separated them. They shouted and tried to explain. Catalan listened, uncertain at first, but their condition was proof that something extraordinary had happened. He threw them bread. He threw them paper. They wrote a message explaining who they were, where the wreck was, and that people were still alive. Catalan carried that message to get help. Rescue helicopters were dispatched, but the operation was difficult. The altitude limited performance, and the weather could turn dangerous without warning. On December 22nd, helicopters reached the glacier and began lifting survivors out. Not everyone could be evacuated in one day. Some spent one more night on the mountain, knowing that rescue existed now and that they would not be abandoned. On December 23rd, the helicopters returned and lifted the remaining survivors to safety. 16 people survived. 29 died. The world called it the miracle of the Andes. Survival did not end the ordeal. The world learned what they had done to stay alive, and public reaction split instantly between fascination, judgment, and disbelief. But the clean version of this story, the one that fits in a sentence, misses what actually made survival possible. It was organization. It was cooperation. It was people taking roles and doing work every day, even when grief was constant. And it was a final decision to leave the wreck and walk into a horizon that looked endless. Many survivors lived with trauma and guilt for years. Some built families. Some returned to medicine and ordinary careers. But none of them ever truly left the mountain, not completely. This story has been adapted because it forces a question audiences can't ignore. In 1993, the film Alive introduced the event to a global audience. In 2023, Society of the Snow revisited the story with a stronger focus on the collective experience and the human cost. Both are adaptations. The timeline you just heard, the dates, the search, the avalanche, the trek, the message to Catalan, and the rescue, is the documented backbone behind every version. The crash itself was sudden. The survival was not. It was 72 days of decisions made under pressure that most people will never face. So here's the question I'll leave you with. Simple, but not easy. If the world stopped looking for you, and the only way home was to make an impossible walk across an impossible range, would you keep going? Write your answer in the comments. And if you want more true stories where survival, history, and human nature collide, subscribe to Silent Past. Because some tragedies don't end at impact. They begin there.